Welcome to our brand new studio here at the Financial Times, where we've been delighted to welcome Jean-Claude Trichet, the President of the European Central Bank. And here to analyse the interview that Mr. Trichet's just given is Ralph Atkins, our Frankfurt Bureau Chief and a specialist on the European Central Bank. Well, Ralph, this is a very wide-ranging interview with Lionel Barber, the editor, but perhaps the most eye-catching comment was about a strengthening of sanctions within the Eurozone system. This, given the crisis there has been in members like Greece and Ireland and Spain of late.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the ECB feels very strongly that it has a message to give to the politicians about the need to make sure Greece cannot happen again by toughening the rules and imposing tougher sanctions, including, and what I thought was interesting was the idea that recalcitrant members that don't live up to their responsibilities on the finances, could even have their voting rights withdrawn and excluded from decision making. I thought that was quite tough from Mr. Trichet.
And is he anticipating what's going to happen here? I mean, why is he saying this?
Well, at the moment there's discussions going on in Brussels about exactly what reforms should be made, and I think the ECB is very keen to have their voice heard on this one.
Okay, well, the Basel Committee on Bank Supervision meets this very weekend, so strengthening of regulation of banks. Basel III is expected. And Mr. Trichet also made some comments there. He pointed out a significant change in global cooperation.
I think one of the major observations, with the benefit myself of my own observation since a number of years, of the present episode, since 3 years, is that we had a silent revolution, a very, very impressive silent revolution. The G20 substituted to the G7. The governance of the world is now fully shared with the emerging economies.
So a silent revolution, Ralph. This is very significant to Mr. Trichet.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, he obviously spends a lot of his time, as well as being a president of the ECB, chairing a lot of these international committees, drawing up the new rule book, if you like. And he's quite anxious that the new rules should apply globally to work, to make sure that something that happens in one country doesn't impose on another country. A global rule book is what he wants, including the emerging market economies, as he pointed out.
Okay, well, finally, Mr. Trichet discusses the crisis of 2007, the interventions that triggered, and then also the rescue packages after the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008.
We need to be sure, and it is, I would say, a sentiment which has to be shared by all, that what we decide would permit to avoid the repetition of what you said, the crisis that we have observed. We have to be fully aware of the dimension of what has been done to avoid what would have been the worst depression since 29. We had to put on the table, to avoid the collapse of the financial sector, something like 27% of the GDP of taxpayer risk on both sides of the Atlantic or both sides of the Channel. The figure is approximately the same, which is telling something profound in the gravity of the situation that all advanced economy had to cope with. This should not be repeated.
So, Ralph, the message there very clearly is never again. What's he going on about there? Well,
there's this big issue, of course, about moral hazard. If banks know they're going to be bailed out, then they will behave irresponsibly. And I think this is sort of what he's saying here. He's not as explicit as or undiplomatic to put in that way, but basically he's saying we need to have a rule book, we need to have systems to make sure this crisis can't happen again, so we don't have to be put in the position which he thinks could be really dangerous of having to do the same thing again.
And the funny thing is that in most of this interview, really, if you think about it, here we were with the President of the European Central Bank, and we didn't discuss monetary policy.
I think that's interesting too. Yes, a few years ago we would have talked about interest rates. He talked a bit about the economy, but the role of central bankers has really changed in the last 3 years, particularly within Europe, where he's had to tackle this whole crisis over the future of the Eurozone. And I think he has become increasingly political, and I think that's what came over in this interview.
And maybe will become more political with 1 year to go in his term.
Yes, he's only got 14 months to go now, and I think maybe he's looking back and rewriting the textbooks, if you like, on central banking.
Ralph Atkins, thank you very much indeed. You can see the full interview at ft.com/view from the top. Goodbye.